Good afternoon and welcome to Gloucestershire Hospitals Foundation Trust annual members meeting. Trying to get this to move on. I'm Deborah Evans, I'm the chair of the trust, and I'd like to welcome everyone who has tuned in today to our annual members meeting. I'm going to say a few words about the format for this afternoon and then we'll get into it. The purpose of our annual members meeting is so that you can ask questions to the trust and we can tell you about our achievements and our challenges for the year that's passed, 21-2, and talk a little bit about what we expect to be happening in the coming year. So there will be an opportunity for questions and answers, and that works through a mechanism called Slido. We can get this up. And as you can see, how that works is that you type Slido into your browser address bar and you enter our event code. When we get to that point in the agenda, we'll put all of this up again so you'll be able to see, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. So over the next hour and a half or so, what are we going to do? I'm just trying to make that slide move on, please. Thank you. The first thing we're going to do is I shall invite our Chief Executive, Deborah Lee, to present the annual report and talk to you about the achievements of the past year. So, Deborah.
Thank you, Deborah. The two Deborahs, as we're becoming known. Thank you. Really delighted to have the opportunity to reflect on the last year. 7 months ago since that year ended, so I'm going to also provide you with some of the more contemporary things that are happening in the Trust. But what are my reflections on the last year? Well, it's been one of the most challenging years in the NHS's 75 history. The challenges have changed, but I don't think they've particularly diminished. I wouldn't have thought that I'd be looking back on those early months of the pandemic and thinking that things felt straightforward, but actually compared to some of the challenges we're confronting now, it indeed feels more difficult. For me, it continues to be an absolute privilege to lead and serve the people of Gloucestershire, and particularly to lead my colleagues in our trust. And that's despite the very significant challenges that lie ahead, and not least those recently highlighted by the Care Quality Commission. I remain in awe of the skills, compassion and dedication of my colleagues at Gloucestershire Hospitals. They are without doubt our most precious resource. For those of you that work in the hospital, you'll hopefully know that I am out and about, walking around the hospital, chatting to all of you. The stories that you tell me inspire me. Our relationship with system partners continue to develop, and I think particularly recently there's increasing evidence of the benefit of those partnerships for our patients and the communities that we seek to serve together. And on that, my final reflection is that our relationships with our communities, with those of you watching, listening today, have never been more important. So looking back on the last year, what are the highlights? I was conscious when I was putting this slide together of something that I read in the CQC report, that I read in the Health Service Journal, and that has been said to me in the time that I've been at the Trust. I am renowned for being positive, for being an optimist, having my cup half full, and people have reflected that we're sometimes trying to put a positive spin on things that aren't very positive. So I make no apologies for being proud of the things that we've achieved, but I hope to also reflect some balance into my presentation, to reflect not just the great things that we've achieved, but some of the challenges that we've got ahead. So if you've been on our hospital sites of late, you'll know that they feel a little bit like a building site, and that's because we've benefited from £100 million of additional investment. This is money that we attracted into the Trust that we wouldn't otherwise have got if we hadn't bid, to help us deliver our vision of creating 2 centres of excellence, one on our Gloucestershire Royal site to focus on emergency care and urgent care, and our Cheltenham site, which we're increasingly developing as a site that delivers specialist services, particularly cancer care, but also elective and planned care. Our surgeons have become the first in Europe to adopt pioneering next-generation robotic surgery. I've been and watched somebody operate these robots. We've got 2 Cheltenham, where we particularly use them for the care of patients with gynecology and urological problems, but we've got the first in Europe that we're using on the Gloucestershire Royal site to treat patients with upper gastrointestinal cancers. And there are a huge amount of benefits to this technology, not least patients recover more quickly, it's less invasive, and they spend less time in hospital. The Trust continued to deliver elective surgery during the pandemic, and particularly cancer care. So when many of the trusts around us chose to pause their services, we decided to take advantage of the fact that we had two different hospital sites. And some of you may remember we talked about our red site and our green site. Our red site being Gloucestershire Royal, where we continued to deliver urgent emergency care, and particularly the care of patients with COVID. But what that meant was we could develop Cheltenham as our green site, which meant despite the pandemic raging at times, we were continuing to care for patients in a safe way. That meant that 2,500 patients received cancer surgery during the pandemic, many of whom I believe wouldn't have been here today if we hadn't taken that difficult decision. And what does that mean? Well, it means that when it comes to waiting times, we've got fewer patients waiting for routine surgery than any other trust in the region. You can see there, in the last year, we've reduced that further from 3,000 patients waiting more than a year for their surgery to just over 1,000. We achieved 7 out of 9 of the cancer standards, and I'm particularly pleased that with the one that's about access. So if you've been told that perhaps you've got something suspicious, that's the language GPs often use. What you don't want to do is to wait weeks or months to have that suspicion investigated. So 92.8% of our patients, 25,000 patients, were seen within 2 weeks of their referral. And perhaps more importantly, 3/4 of them had a diagnosis which confirmed or excluded cancer within 28 days. We had our best ever score in the National Cancer Patient Experience Survey, making us one of the best in the country. And just to demonstrate that we kept going on all fronts during the last year, we also launched our first green plan and secured £24 million, again, of external funding from the government's decarbonisation fund. And we're making huge strides towards achieving the NHS target of being net zero by 2040. In fact, by 2028, we expect to be about 80% of the way towards that target. So there's such a lot going on, isn't there? I'm going to do another set of our highlights. These are really fantastic. And this one, again, has got a graphic at the side of it to just demonstrate the progress. Some of you that have travelled this journey with us will know that back in 2016 and 2017, we had a failed deployment of our new electronic patient record, and we took a number of years to recover from that. We could have started again and plodded on at the rate we were going, but we took a view that the only way we could explain to ourselves and to our colleagues and make sense of what had happened with that failed deployment was to make sure that we went further and faster than we would have done if we'd not had that bump in the road. And what you can see on the right there is a chart that depicts levels of digitisation in hospitals. And shorthand, 1 to 7. 7 is the most digitalised hospital and therefore the safest hospital. 2 years ago, we were level 1. That's the block with all the reds. And as of today, we're at level 6, so just one more level to go. And those reds on that chart there relate to electronic prescribing, which we go live with on the 2nd of November. So we'll very quickly be knocking on the door of a level 7 HIMSS hospital, which, as I said, means that the safety, reliability of care is as good as it possibly can be with the aid of digital technology. We contributed to the vaccination programme. You might remember when this was launched back in December 21, we were at the vanguard. We had the best vaccination rates in the country week after week, and that's not changed with the booster programme. We're #1 in the country for uptake of that booster, and I'm particularly pleased that we're doing that in a very targeted way. So just shy of 90% of patients in care homes have now had their booster vaccination, and 46% of people in the county that are eligible have had their vaccination. We've established a professor of nursing in conjunction with Worcestershire University, and we've overseen the first intake of medical students to a new medical school, the Three Counties Medical School, hosted by, again, Worcestershire University. We've started work on our inaugural mental health strategy, and this isn't just a strategy for patients with mental health problems. It's a strategy that recognises that many of our colleagues, their families, their patients' families, are also experiencing challenges in relation to their mental well-being. And of course, it'll come as no surprise to those who know our organisation to hear that we were shortlisted for a number of national or regional awards. Kate, at last count, Kate keeps this account for me with our globals. At last count, we've been shortlisted or awarded 20 different awards for both clinical and non-clinical initiatives that we'd led. And we did deliver our financial plan and indeed achieved a very small surplus. So they're just some of the highlights. I'm really proud of what we've achieved, not least because we've achieved it in adversity. We've achieved it when our colleagues felt that their tanks were empty, when they felt they hadn't got much more to give. And I think that's a really important context for us to remember. So what are the challenges ahead? Well, without doubt, our greatest challenge are those related to our workforce. I've already reflected the value that I place on my colleagues, but that the whole trust places on our colleagues. And it's really important that we continue to ensure that they feel resilient, that they feel valued, and they're able to deliver the best care that they want to deliver, despite the often challenging circumstances. I meet staff who are on occasions distressed that they can't deliver the quality of care that they'd like to deliver. And that's not good. You know, in fact, that's really difficult for any of us to hear. And we're doing our best to make it possible to deliver the best care, but we know that that's not always possible. And therefore, it's really important that we support staff to cope with that, so that they continue to feel that they are adding value. And retaining staff. We heard recently 40,000 nurses are leaving the NHS this year. And so whilst we're in a reasonably good place with respect to our turnover and our vacancies, it's really, really vital for the future that we develop an organisation where staff want to stay, an organisation that staff recommend to others as a place to work. And being innovative in the way that we recruit our staff, develop our workforce. I spent an afternoon recently in the Queen's Hotel in Cheltenham, where we invited our 187 international nurses to come and experience English cream tea as part of their settlement into Gloucestershire. And I met some amazing colleagues. I sat on the table with 8 young Indian nurses who'd, on their own, come from India to build a future in Gloucestershire. They'd met each other at the airport. They hadn't met each other before, yet they were this table of buzzing individuals, really, really excited to be here in Gloucestershire, supporting us to deliver really great care. I've touched upon how we're working with our partners, but the thing I want to really impress upon you, the challenges we continue to face in relation to urgent and emergency care. And particularly the way that that manifests in relation to ambulance services. I'm sure many of you will have seen media coverage about ambulances that continue to queue at the front of our hospitals because we can't bring them into our emergency departments, because we can't get patients out of there into our beds. And the root cause of that is many different issues, but the most significant one is that we've got around 220 patients in our bed on any given day who are ready to go home from hospital, but for a variety of reasons, usually because they require additional support and care in their homes or a place in a care home, can't leave, and that's a really big issue for us. But we have focused, the last 4 weeks in fact, we've had a really great initiative running where we've said, let's just focus on the things that we can improve. That stuff's hard, it's not all in our control, but the things in our gift that we can do things about. And I'm absolutely, well, I am amazed, but I'm actually shocked at what we've achieved in a short space of time. So for 4 weeks now, we haven't had an ambulance wait more than 4 hours to offload a patient. And you'll have seen stories of patients in the backs of ambulances for 18, 20, 24 hours. But more importantly, that has meant that from a peak of patients waiting 160 minutes, nearly 3 hours, to receive an ambulance response in the community, we've had the mean time of 34 minutes for that ambulance response. Now, that's not the standard that we try to achieve. 18 minutes is the promise from Ambulance Trust to patients that call an ambulance in that situation. But 160 minutes to 34 in the last 4 weeks is something that I'm really proud of. Now, the challenge is, how do we sustain that? How do we embed that? Because that's taking a lot of people, a lot of effort. And the way we'll do that is by addressing this issue I've talked about in relation to both our back door but also our front door. And I've described some really positive things in relation to the legacy of patients waiting for care and treatment, and we are doing really well. I mentioned those 1,100 patients that have been waiting more than a year for care. Clearly that's 1,100 too many. But if you were waiting in Bristol, you'd be one of 9,000. If you're waiting in Devon, you'd be one of 16,000. So whilst, as I say, 1,000's 1,000 too many, it just gives you a sense of how well we're doing in Gloucestershire. Achieving financial balance is going to become more challenging. We've had some real success. I stood here in 2016 apologising to my colleagues for the deterioration, the unexpected deterioration in our financial position. You may remember we deteriorated our position by 45 million over the course of a few weeks as we surfaced the true position, and it's been a battle hard fought and well won to get to a position where for the last 2 years we've had financial balance. So it is tough going forward, but we've got strong foundations to work from, and I hope that we'll be here next year talking about another year where we've achieved that position. Maintaining our digital estate, our digital programme and our estate is a really big challenge. Imagine an organisation of our scale having £24 million on average to deal with its financial challenges in relation to capital. So that's replacing equipment, it's dealing with our backlog maintenance, it's developing new buildings. So capital is a really significant issue for public services generally, but the NHS in particular. And finally, managing public expectations of what the NHS can deliver and at what pace in the next year and beyond. Rightly, people have high expectations of the NHS. It's a phenomenal service. I am so proud of the fact that I'm part of a service that continues to deliver care free at the point of delivery. But that's getting harder, and patients' experiences aren't always as positive as we'd like them to be because of some of those challenges. And coming to more recent times, those challenges were reflected back to us very clearly in the recent inspection report following the Care Quality Commission's visit to our organisation back in June. And they reflected some really important things to us, many of which I think we recognised, many of which I know we were beginning to address, but not at the pace or at the scale that we need to. And that's where our attention is turning to now, both in respect of addressing the shortcomings identified by the CQC in relation to maternity and surgical services, but also in relation to the things they reflected back to us about our culture. And in particular, resetting our governance now in the context of being beyond the pandemic. The CQC rightly reflected that some of the rigour, process controls around our governance had slipped during the pandemic. That wasn't a surprise to them or us, but what they reflected was we hadn't got back on top of that as quickly as they thought we should have done, and that's what we're paying our attention to now. The issues in relation to culture are a real challenge, and our first priority for the year ahead is to ensure that we develop and maintain a culture where everyone feels valued, regardless of their characteristics. I would love to think that in a year or two, the majority of our staff will be recommending our hospitals as a place to work. This is tricky, this is societal. I was really saddened to read a statistic recently that said 29% of colleagues from a black and minority ethnic background in the NHS, working in the NHS nationally, report themselves as having been subject to discrimination of one form or another. In our hospitals, that was a bit higher, so the national average was 29%. For our hospitals, that was 32%. So we've got some real work to do there. And we're doing some good stuff. We're hearing some really positive things from colleagues about the changes, but as I've said, we need to go further and faster, and there's nothing that I feel more impatient for than making progress in respect of this issue around culture. I've touched on our priority in relation to staff, and this isn't just about looking forward. We talk about staff carrying moral injury, and the pandemic impacted on people in different ways. We required colleagues to work in unfamiliar services. They saw things that perhaps they hadn't seen before, that they weren't prepared for. And so it's not just about supporting people for the future, it's helping them to recover from some of the things that impacted on them during the pandemic. We have to redress the imbalance that I've talked about in relation to health and social care. The demand for acute care is rising. Again, legacy issues from the pandemic. But I believe hospitals are expensive places. Care in a hospital bed is very, very expensive. These are scarce resources. The skills of our staff are expert, but they're scarce resources. I'd love to be in a situation where we're caring for only those people that need acute care, because those that don't need acute care are being looked after in the community or they've found their way to their next pathway following admission, which might be in a care home, but more likely to be in their own home with support from community services and community care. If that means our hospitals can be 200 or 300 beds smaller, bring it on. So what are the other things that we're focusing on? Well, we hear a lot about health inequalities, and particularly, I think the pandemic shone a light on inequalities in a way that it hadn't been shone before, and I think that's been really important. We heard about colleagues that died in the pandemic, staggering statistics. 85% of nurses that died in the pandemic were from a black or minority ethnic group. Similar figures for doctors. We know that when we look at outcomes for patients with a learning disability were more likely to die if they got COVID. Patients that again came from a BMA background were more likely to die if they got COVID. And these are inequalities that we shone the light on that we're now trying to address. But of course we also know that people from these communities don't access care as willingly or as easily as we would like to think that they could. And so making sure that we develop our services and offer them in a way that those groups are likely to come forward, like to feel able to come forward, want to come forward, is going to be really, really vital. And that means that lots of this care won't be delivered by us, but hopefully we'll be working with our partners in the voluntary sector, in community services, in social care, to offer our expertise so that they can deliver more for patients in our communities. There's this thing called winter looming. I don't think we have a winter plan anymore. I think we have a seasonal plan. Gone are the days when we all had a bit of a break over the summer and got ready for winter. It feels like we're in an eternal winter with a super winter ahead of us. But it is really important that we recognise the challenges. We've had a fortunate couple of years in relation to influenza. So normally our worry would have been a flu outbreak, but the protection that people took to protect themselves from COVID meant for the last few years we've had very little flu circulating. That looks like it's going to change this winter. We look at things that happen in the southern hemisphere and it tells us that we're likely to have more influenza than we've seen previously. In fact, we've got influenza circulating now, which is a bit sooner than we typically see it. And one of our big priorities is to conclude our programme around our centres of excellence that I've talked about already, our Fit for the Future programme. I talked about our buildings. In January, in Cheltenham, we'll be opening a state-of-the-art day surgery facility. That will allow us to do more day surgery. It will allow us to care for patients that would typically have required an inpatient stay, to have their care as a day surgery patient. And that means that 1,000 or so patients that are still waiting more than a year for care, we can see more of them more quickly and therefore reduce those waiting times even further. We're going to progress our digital journey. I've talked already about our electronic prescribing programme, which is going to be an absolute game changer, both in terms of ease of access for clinicians wanting to prescribe, but it will help us to ensure patients can be discharged more promptly because they won't be waiting for their medicines to take home. But where it will particularly add value is in terms of safety, reliable, safe prescribing. And of course, as I've already touched upon, this is going to be a great segue into my colleague Karen Johnson, who's going to talk to us about our finances. Our final priority of the year ahead is maintaining financial stability in an increasingly uncertain world. So I hope that does feel like a balanced and fair reflection, but I hope the thing I've impressed upon you, perhaps more than anything, is the amazing things that my colleagues in Gloucestershire hospitals have achieved on our behalf in the last year. Thank you. Karen.
Can I have the switch? Deb. Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. I think I've got about 10 minutes or so just to run through the financial results for 21-22. So as Deborah's already indicated, we did end the year with just over £500,000 surplus against a planned break-even position. So a fantastic achievement for the Trust. Unlike 2021, where costs were just matched against expenditure during the first year of the pandemic, the integrated care system received a fixed level of funding, and that was to fund our business as usual, as well as a continuation of cost that was targeted to a continued COVID pressure. We had to work collaboratively together as system partners to make sure that that allocation was therefore split and reflected where our spend incurred across the ICS. And as you'll see on the two graphical tables on the slide, that our plan and our actual income, there's a difference of about £35 million. And that's because there was certain additional funding that was funded as pass-through. So our high-cost drugs was over our budget by the tune of about £6 million. We had additional grant funding that came in to support our environmental agenda of carbon neutral. That was just shy of £12 million. In addition, Deborah's already alluded to the pressures of winter and the fact that we have continued our elective recovery during 2021, and we received just over £6 million of additional funding to support that. And finally, we got some funding in terms of our pay award. So all of that contributed to an additional £35 million on top of the plan, which was matched with expenditure. So although 21-22 was definitely, it felt financially an easier year compared to pre-pandemic, we still had to make a level of efficiencies to break even at the end of the year. And our target was to deliver 7 million. We ended up delivering 8.1. Of which 5 million of that was non-recurrent. And when I say non-recurrent, that just means it's a one-off benefit rather than something that's sustained and will happen year on year. So again, fantastic achievement when you're faced with growing your elective work as well as trying to drive out some efficiencies. And then finally, again, Deborah's already mentioned this, but I really pride myself as working in Gloucester hospitals because we did not compromise our elective activity through the pandemic. Clearly, it did go down when you base it on 1920 levels, but you can see there that in 21-22, we delivered 96% of our 1920 levels, and I can say that that's continued into 22-23. So this slide just provides a breakdown of where we spend our money, and of the just over 700 million, about 60% of that goes on our pay. So our workforce is by far our most valuable asset. But you can also see that we spend quite a lot on non-pay, and I've listed them out there for information for you. But typically, the high areas of spend tend to be on our drugs. Our income there, you can see, of the £700 million, £625 million comes from our commissioners, of which our two biggest commissioners are Gloucester and our specialist commissioning, and those two added together equate to 80% of that value. So it's important that we work collaboratively together with them to ensure that we get the best outputs for our Gloucester patients. So capital. Deborah mentioned £24 million, and on this slide you can see that we spent £67 million. And that's because we are in receipt of additional money around strategic site development. So all the work that has been mentioned previously around increasing our sites and in terms of our estates and improving the way that we function, we've got a significant amount of additional money there. But in addition, we do ensure that we bid for money during the year. So there's always opportunities to bid for extra capital. And at the start of the year, the plan was 57 million and we ended up with 67. So we ended up getting an additional £10 million worth of capital money to invest on this site. And one of the areas of spend was the surgical robots, as Deb's mentioned previously. So, I was so proud to be part of that process. So, looking ahead, so 22-23. Again, we've received an ICS central allocation, and again, we've worked very hard as three organisations within the ICS to ensure that that allocation is split to reflect where our spend is. However, there is a requirement for all NHS systems to get back to a pre-pandemic level of funding. And what that means is that we are now faced with a more considerable value of efficiencies as we move into 22-23. And you can see there for the Trust, it's circa £19 million. And that's a real challenge for any trust that's still trying to recover their elective activity as well as cope with all of the pressures that we're experiencing in terms of urgent care. So exciting times ahead. So we had the formation of the Integrated Care Boards. They became statutory bodies from July 2022. And although we worked as an integrated care system prior to that, I have seen a change in the way that we work collectively as a system. And I do feel that, watch this space, exciting times ahead. So thank you very much. I'd like to hand over to Deborah Evans now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. I'm going to say a few words about our Council of Governors and how it works, and then I'm going to hand over to Alan Thomas, who is our lead governor. So I'm his warm-up act. One of my roles is to chair the Council of Governors as well as the Trust Board. So in that way, we bring those two closer together. And I just wanted to say a few words about who governors are and how we work with them. And I think the first thing to say is that we really value the contribution of our governors. This slide shows our public governors who are elected from the Foundation Trust membership. And we have 2 governors for each of the 6 district council areas in Gloucestershire. So you can see them here. And of course, it's really important, I think, if you want to achieve good outcomes, then what you are after is diversity of thought. So having public governors drawn from all over Gloucestershire is really helpful to us. And of course, it's also helpful that we have stakeholder governors, and they may be drawn from organisations like the university, like Age UK. So we have stakeholder governors who are from organisations who have an interest or work alongside health and social care. And of course, we have staff governors. So we draw on all of those sources for feedback about our services. So that is a really important thing to us. And I would just like to thank those governors who serve on our trust committees or who attend our board meetings, because none of those are short and they're quite intense. But to give you an example, we have a quality and performance committee and we have a finance and digital committee. They each have public governors sitting on them. And we ask our public governors to give us feedback at the end of every meeting and to make observations. And I'm very grateful for that, because we always have considered, thoughtful, insightful contributions. And of course, some of our business is quite sensitive and confidential. So for that to happen, we need a high level of trust with our governors. And I'm pleased to say that we have that. So it may be that several or all of our governors are on this meeting, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to thank them for the work that they do in whatever the way they do it. Deborah Lee has already mentioned that we have developed for the first time a mental health strategy, the whole person strategy, and that's a good example, and Alan may well talk about this because I know this is an interest of his, but it's a good example of where governors have prompted us and nudged us to prioritise this work and have emphasised how important it is in acute hospitals like ours that we get this right, and also how important it is that we prioritise support for our own colleagues. So again, a good example of how governors make an important contribution and how much we value them. I don't want to talk for too long because really this is stealing Alan's thunder. So I just wanted to hand over to him, and in doing so to note that This is his last appearance with us. He has been loyal and committed and a very important servant of the Trust for many years. So, of course, one of the things he did was appoint me, so I'm grateful for that, because it's an important role of governors that they appoint chairs and non-executive directors. So I would like to say thank you to him for appointing me, but also thank you to him for his long-standing service to the Trust. And I'm going to hand over to him and invite him to make his remarks. Would you like this or not? You probably don't need it.
I don't really want it,
No,
because
I don't think you need it.
My slide is very minimal. Hello again. This will be my 9th appearance as an honorary member's appearance, may my last. I will indulge myself slightly by perhaps doing something slightly different this time. Give me the opportunity to thank some people, give me the opportunity to say one or two things about the role of the governor and how I think it's an important role. But first, just on the reflection, I have done this role for 9 years, and there's a reason that our constitution says 9 years is it, you can't do any more. A bit similar to non-executive directors, where we have a 6-year rule. I mean, clearly, I think somebody just recently mentioned the word diversity of thought, and it's always good to refresh thinking around everything. And I've said my piece for nearly 9 years, and other people now need to do the same thing. So I agree with the concept, although I am going to be quite sad and not quite sure what to do after today. I'd normally start this with a football reference, with the ex-chair, Peter Lececki, who I believe is potentially listening in. Of course, he's now basking back in his chair with Newcastle United towards the top of the Premiership with all their money. So well done, Peter, and thank you for the England scarf that you gave me as a leaving present. It's making quite a good warmer underneath the door. Secondly, I've been buoyed up for this event by attending a Bob Dylan concert last night in Cardiff. 81-year-old. He's still singing even better, actually, than he has been singing for many years. And I'm still hearing his voice as I'm speaking now. Marvellous occasion. So, some of you know I'm an ex-military individual, and in my military training we learned about the sort of bucket approach to debriefing. So I'm going to sort of conduct a debrief of myself of a 9-year period as a governor. The bucket approach sort of starts nice and positively, takes you down into the depths of what's disappointing, and then it brings you back up at the end to actually make you all feel very nice and warm about yourselves when we leave. And I hope I'll do that. I will finish on a positive note. So start, though, with a number of thanks to my colleague governors. Particularly those who are retiring. So Hilary Bowen, Graham Coughlin, Jeff Cave and Julia Preston. Thank you for all your support, and welcome to all the new governors that have been recently elected. I think we have 7 new governors this time, which is a big change to the governing body. I want to thank in particular, though, of my colleagues. I want to thank Anne Davis, Maggie Powell and Hilary Bowen for their sort of persistence, along with myself, in putting mental health at the top of our agenda. I think Deborah referred to it, and both Deborahs referred to it, actually. I think it is becoming now a part of the Acute Trust in the way it should have been for a while. I'd like to thank Anne Davis again and Jeff Cave for their persistence about youth representation on the Council of Governors. We now are in a position where we have young people representing youth at our meetings, and hopefully sooner or later we will have a full governor of that type. thank you to both of you, particularly you two. And I also need to thank Jeff, who has not been re-elected as a governor, but I'd like to thank him particularly for his consistent and persistent approach to listening to communities, how important it is for us as governors to listen to what our public, if you like, think about what's going on in the hospital and about the diversity of approach that we need to maintain. So thank you to all of those. Also, good wishes to Andrea, who I believe hasn't been particularly well recently. So that's a sort of positive start. Now, a few disappointments. I have, some recently, some for a little while. I am disappointed that this is the third event where we have no members present. I hope, sincerely hope, that next year you will be able to find the ability to have at least some members present at this annual members meeting. I think this virtual approach works really well, but I'm speaking to an empty room in effect isn't quite the same as speaking to a group of people who can sort of look back at you and look back into your eyes. I'm a little disappointed that we still haven't really got back to having membership events, whether they're virtual or face-to-face. Membership events about clinical practices, anything to make being a member worthwhile, in a sense. Why do you become a member of a foundation trust? Well, you're interested in it, aren't you? And so you want to know what's going on in it. And I'd really, again, like to encourage the trust to think members and think membership events. Governors themselves, I think it's true that no governor elected in the last 3 years has had a tour of the hospital. I'm disappointed by the fact that that is the case. Governors have found it. Obviously, the pandemic has made it very difficult for us to be in the hospital. But we can't do our job properly unless we know what the hospital's like. And we have reintroduced some governor visits, but again, hopefully over the next 12 months, there will be much more of that. And of course, can't say, as governors, we are disappointed with the CQC reports, but I'm not going to repeat what Deborah has said about all of that. It's just disappointing to me personally that I started 9 years ago. I think the trust requires improvement then, and it's now requires improvement again, having gone through a sort of an upward trajectory, and I'll come back to it, but I'm sure we haven't seen the last of the good nature of reports. So I could say a few more disappointments. I won't prolong that, but I'd just like to re-emphasise to my future, not colleagues, but successors in this role as lead governor or as a governor of the trust, how important it is to remember the NHS Constitution, which gives the right to the public, to the patient, to be involved in all aspects of health and social care, from planning to delivery. It's a really good read, the NHS Constitution, and particularly the paragraph that talks about those rights. Our job as public governors is to represent the public, staff governors to represent the staff, and stakeholder governors to give the point of view of the particular organisation. The patient is at the centre of what most government work is all about, and we mustn't forget that. Always put the patient first, notwithstanding everything that Deborah says about the workforce's challenges, about the fact that a happy staff is going to make for happy patients. So both go together, but let's not forget the patient. So going back up the bucket side, and I want to make a few thanks. It's very difficult. This trust has all its staff come to work to help patients. But I'm going to indulge myself by thanking a few people that I've spotted, if you like, over the time that I've been here as a governor. Apologies to those that I don't mention specifically, because I value everything that everybody does in this trust. But I'm going to start with Emma Husbands and Sam White and the End of Life and Palliative Care team, who I think just simply do a fantastic job for the weakest members of our community. And they deserve all the praise they can get. I'd like to thank Jeanette Welsh and her Learning Disabilities team, again, for what they do for those people who are less fortunate than ourselves. I've seen some amazing examples of work done in that area. I'd like to thank Faye Noble and the team in Emergency Department and the way that they have raised the mental health issues in ED so well over the last couple of years. And I'd like to thank, I had somebody else down here a minute ago, and I'm going to move on to the board. So those, I definitely want to thank those. I want to talk about the board a little bit. I'd like to thank Simon Lansley and Mick Griffiths and what they've done and his team on the Fit for the Future programme over the last few years. I think they're a great example of a team that has listened to what the public has said, learned from the way that the first Fit for the Future programme was done, and developed it in Fit for the Future 2. A really good example of listening and acting. I'd like to thank Karen Johnson and the finance team for making finance almost interesting. A great team who really seem to want to work in finance, and the way that their training programme was developed and the way they've involved governors in that, I'd really like to commend that. I'd like to thank Mark Petroni personally. He got me into hospital, I think perhaps in the nick of time last year, so I'd like to thank him personally for doing that. And I'd like to thank Peter Lececki, in the past, but the chair, for all the work he did as chair. I am sure that Deborah Evans, who she's right in saying we appointed Deborah, so we must have done the right thing, and we can't have appointed a bad chair, can we? So Deborah Evans, I'm sure, will carry on in that line. Most particularly, though, I have to thank Deborah Lee. Deborah Lee is, I believe, one of the outstanding CEOs in the country. And we know that she's had her health issues. We're really pleased to see her back in the trust. And it must be really disappointing to her personally to see the product of the CQC inspections. But I can think of no one better placed to put that right in this trust, provided people trust in her. And there's no reason not to. She's an outstandingly capable individual who will bring this trust back up to its good, and hopefully at some point into outstanding. This trust is not an inadequate trust. Every trust requires some improvement in some areas, and this one is no different. But I'd just like to thank her. I've enjoyed working with Deborah over the last 6 years. 6.5. Time goes much quicker the older you get. So I think I'll probably end there. Within a day or two, I won't have an NHS email address. I'll not see what's going on, but I will just, one warning, I am a big believer in the Freedom of Information Act, and expect the odd little question that might come in from the sidelines. Thank you very much for your time, and I wish the Trust every success in the future.
Thank you very much, Alan, for a very candid and constructive commentary there on your time in the Trust, which we appreciate enormously. What we're going to do now is we're going to have a 5-minute break so that we can get ourselves ready for the question and answer session. So I'm going to suggest that we reconvene at 5 to 4. So those of you who have joined us from home have got time to put the kettle on, don't crash the grid in all doing it at the same time, and have a comfort break, and we'll reconvene at 5 to 4, and I'll take you through the method for asking questions. Thank you.
Sorry, is everybody ready? From that,
Okay. So welcome meeting. We've got plenty of questions flowing in, I'm pleased to say, so please keep them coming. I'm going to start not with a question but a comment. It is from my predecessor, Peter Lececki, who until a few months ago was chair of the trust, and he is replying to Alan, and he says, regardless of Alan's football affiliation, the people of Gloucestershire owe Alan a huge debt of gratitude for all the challenge and support he has given. So thank you, Alan, for that. I think that's very sincerely meant by Peter. So it's good to know that Peter is part of our audience today. And Peter, please feel free to throw in any more questions or comments as we go along. If the questions look like they're drying up, I shall turn to you. So the next question that I wanted to take is one from Stephen Andrews, who says, member events have just been mentioned. Fit for the Future 2 has run similar events. GWH have already introduced virtual member events. What about GNHSFT?
I think it's a really great point. I think when the pandemic struck, we closed lots of these activities down, and we've perhaps been a bit slow to get some of those back going. I think we are in a place where not only can we consider virtual member events, but also some face-to-face ones. What I'd love us to get to, Deborah, is a situation where we can run increasingly hybrid events, because we do know that when we run virtual events, more people can join us, more people can engage. But there are other events where it's really great to have the opportunity to meet up, network. So a commitment to review that and to roll out those events in the next year or so.
That's really helpful, Deb, and I think you're right about creating the balance, because there's nothing quite like getting together with people in the same room or walking around together. So that's very helpful.
And what would be great, Deb, for members that are listening is to give us a sense of the sorts of things you'd like to, us to put on. What are your interest areas? I know we've run in the past where we've run topic sessions, so we've run sessions on osteoporosis and heart disease, but then we've run other sessions to do with our own services or our own challenges. So if you've got thoughts, you don't need to tell us now, but you can access us through our members' inbox on our website, the sorts of things you'd like us to put on.
That's very helpful, thank you. Another question has come in which says, how may energy costs impact on the provision of services over the coming winter and beyond? And I seem to recollect a figure from our Finance Committee only this morning that said we'd got an £800,000 pressure as a result of increased energy costs. So you can congratulate me on my memory, but Karen, maybe you'd like to respond to that. Are energy costs going to actually impact on services?
The impact of energy is impacting on our financial position, absolutely. And it's looking like the 800 will be more than that by the end of the year, because we don't really know what's going to happen in the next few months. Is it impacting on our services? No, not at the moment, because we are under financial pressure, but we're looking at ways of trying to mitigate that at the moment. Nationally, there is a recognition that inflation is going to be financial pressure across the NHS, so not just Gloucestershire. So I would like to think that there will be maybe some national solution around how we can support the energy costs moving forward.
But we're not expecting to have to reduce or change services as a result of energy cost problems.
That's not in our plan.
No. Okay. So reassurance there that we don't expect energy costs to impact on the services we provide this winter or beyond. Thank you very much. And then here's a question from Stephen Andrews. Can the slides be sent out so that we have time to read them?
They can indeed, yes.
They can. I think we can publish them on our website.
Yeah, we'll do that.
So we'll be very happy to do that. I'm getting a thumbs up from the team at the back. So we'll definitely do that. Next question, looking to the future, what impact will implementation of the integrated care system have on the way the hospital works? Will funding be moved to social care?
I'll have a go at that one. GP and have a quick conversation, a quick consultation. So what GPs are trying to respond to is the different needs, preferences, wishes of how people engage with their primary care services. In respect of community services, I sit around a board table with partners that run Gloucestershire Health and Care Services. I sit with partners that deliver social care. And again, the evidence is that those services have grown, have developed. So if the person that sent that in has got specific examples of where they think services aren't there or are indeed failing, please do get back in touch with us and I can pass those across to the organisations responsible for delivering community services. But from my perspective, I don't see that to be the case.
Good. Thank you very much. Moving on to a different kind of question. The question is, how is morale amongst staff and what are you doing to support staff? And I wondered whether our Director for People, Claire Radley, would like to come and stand at the mic and give us some thoughts about that.
Yes, so morale's something that we talk about a lot. Morale probably is not quite where we want it to be, although of course that isn't everywhere in the hospital. There are some parts of the hospital where morale is really very good. I would say morale at the moment is impacted by three things primarily. So one, of course, is pay, and members of the public will know that there are lots of ballots out there at the moment that relate to the issues of pay. The other is the operational pressures, which you'll have heard already lots about. But there's also something about the team dynamics, which we're paying some attention to internally. So if I think about cost of living crisis, so what are we doing about morale? Cost of living feels like a really significant issue, which is affecting staff as much as it affects members of the public. Our staff, of course, are also members of the public. And there is something really important for us about looking at implementing the real living wage. So we're in the middle of looking at that at the moment. The real living wage has just changed, so we're just now costing all of that up, but it feels a really important thing for us to do as a responsible employer in Gloucestershire. We're also looking at lots of different cost of living options for staff. So we're also looking at whether we can provide discounted food, and we're looking to work with our partners to make sure that we have a shared approach to all of the activities. And there's lots of signposting because there's lots of services out there that our staff can access that they may not know about. So we're making sure that that's the case. And then finally, the team dynamics piece. We're in the process of looking at how we really invest in our teams. We know that happy teams are the reason why people stay in organisations. So all the work that we can do focused on teams feels really important. Investing in relationships, I guess, is the key issue here.
Thank you very much, Claire. And this question I'm going to ask Mark Pietroni, our Medical Director, to answer. The question is, the Hospitals Trust has been rated as requires improvement, while other services have been rated as inadequate. Are the hospitals safe? And Mark is Director of Safety as well as Medical Director. So would you like to, if you've got a mic on, you've got a mic on.
Thank you, Deborah, for that question. The CQC inspection and the ratings are stark. They're very disappointing for staff in those services, and they're obviously of concern to members of the public. We take them very seriously. When you get a report from the CQC, it comes with a list of actions, some of which are classed as must-dos and some of which are classed as should-dos. And we have action plans in place, both in maternity and in surgery, and we have already delivered most of the actions that the CQC would like us to deliver and addressed the issues of concern to them. As Deborah has said, we have perhaps not been as fast to recover from the pandemic as some other trusts, and we are addressing that now. And I'm confident that we will complete the action plans that the CQC has asked us to do. Certainly within this year, there's a time frame set by the CQC, and we're well on track. In terms of members of the public, I would just like to reassure members of the public that, in particular in those two services, in surgery and in maternity services, if you need hospital care, we really don't want you to not come when you need care. That's much more likely to result in harm, and we really want to encourage people to come to the hospitals. And why do I say that? Well, in the two areas of most concern, emergency surgery and maternity services, if you look at our outcomes, they are well in line with national averages. In fact, our emergency surgery outcomes are better than most trusts in the country. And secondly, in particular in terms of our maternity services, in two recent national surveys, the unit in Gloucester has been rated by service users and their partners, relatives, as the best place to deliver in the country. So whilst we are obviously responding to the concerns of the CQC, we really don't want people to be afraid or reluctant to come to hospital or receive the care that they need. It's really important that people can be reassured and come and access care when they need to.
Thank you, Mark. Another CQC related question. So CQC is Care Quality Commission, they're our regulator. And this one says, I'm aware of the CQC report. It is what it is. My question is, how will all the staff and volunteers at the Trust ensure that they all take time off to adequately rest? Now, I don't know, Claire Radley, whether you'd like to, or whether Deb would like to.
I'll start.
You'll start, okay.
And this is a really important point, isn't it? And of course, everybody employed in the Trust, they have opportunities to take breaks. So what's really important, and we've instilled this in our line managers, we must ensure that our teams take the annual leave that they're entitled to. And we limit the amount of leave that staff can carry forward into future years, because we want to encourage them to take the leave that's due to them. Now, that's not always easy, particularly when there may be shortages in a team, but we try really hard. The other thing that we're really working hard on is people taking breaks when they're on shift. And I hear far too many occasions when colleagues tell me that they had their lunch on the hop while they were walking around, that they couldn't leave the ward area, they couldn't get to our canteens. And again, we know that if you're going to remain focused, remain resilient, it's really important that you get away from your workplace. This applies equally to people working from home. I hear colleagues say they got to their kitchen table at 7 in the morning and they're still there at 7 at night. So again, encouraging people, giving people permission, saying it's okay to walk your dog if you're having a working from home day. Giving people permission. What we're interested in is that you do the job we've asked you to do and that you remain well while you're doing that. So that's kind of easier said than done, given the operational challenges. But what I believe we're trying to do is to make it clear to people that it's what we want you to do. We want you to take your holidays, we want you to take your breaks, and we'll make that as easy as we possibly can.
That's good. And Claire, you might have something to add to this.
Yeah, just one thing to add. So notwithstanding the challenges associated with staff being able to take their leave, this year the Trust has also given staff an extra 2 days, and we've called those wellbeing days. So we're encouraging staff to do something on those additional 2 days that would support their health and wellbeing.
That's great, thank you very much. And now I've got a question that I'm going to ask to somebody who I know has got a dog. And the question is that it's good to see that the Trust made a small surplus, but with challenges in public sector finances, how confident are you about next year? And in particular, are services going to be cut? So we're going to ask that question to Karen Johnson, our Director of Finance and proud owner of a lockdown dog. I don't know whether she walks the dog when she's working at home.
I do, but it tends to be at 7 o'clock in the evening, unfortunately, when it's a bit dark. But there we go. So I think I said, didn't I, in my presentation that this current year we're having to find £19 million worth of efficiencies. And that, to be fair, is a real challenge for the Trust. And we're not alone in that. Many trusts across the country are experiencing similar things. So I wouldn't want you to go away thinking that the finances are going to be as easy as they have been in the last couple of years, because they're not. And we do know that moving forward into 2023-24, that challenge is likely to increase. What we are doing, though, is that we can't just keep cutting. We can't keep cutting budgets and expecting people to do the same. So we've changed our approach this year in terms of how we try and identify areas of opportunity where we do feel that there's opportunities where we can do things slightly cheaper. And we're doing that by means of increasing our productivity, but keeping the same cost base. We're looking at how we look at doing things right the first time, so getting it right first time, the GIRFT reviews that come out of some of the clinical work there. And finally, we're looking at collaboration of services across the ICS, and also looking at external support as well, in particular around our urgent care, because that's where some of our pressures, our financial pressures, are coming from. So we're not at this stage saying we're going to cut services. That's not what we're here to do. We're here to make sure that the public pound of Gloucester is used in the most appropriate way and delivers as best we possibly can for the Gloucester residents.
Thank you very much, Karen. Dog walking Karen. And this question is for Craig Bradley, who's our Deputy Director of Nursing. And Craig, it's a question in two parts. The first part is, how is COVID impacting on the hospitals right now?
Thanks, Deborah. So COVID is impacting on the hospitals. The pandemic hasn't gone away just yet. So we've had a constant stream of patients coming into hospital because of COVID, and also patients that test positive for COVID whilst presenting for something else. So you may have broken a hip, come in, and we find that you've got COVID already. That does have an impact on our services, because when you've got people in close quarters next to each other, it is quite easy for COVID to spread around. So we do see outbreaks of COVID in the hospital as well. Now that has the disruption that, of course, it makes people sick, that we don't want that to happen at all. But it also makes our staff sick, which makes them go off sick, so we have fewer staff around. But it also means that we can't necessarily discharge people as quickly as we'd like into the community, because they've got COVID, can't go back to a care home, and so on. So it is still causing a big problem. You can help tackle this by getting your COVID jab. You can get a COVID jab if you've never had one. So anyone over the age of 5 can get their COVID jab right now if you've never had a COVID jab. The autumn booster programme is now live. So if you're over 50 or you've been told you're at risk of COVID, you can get a COVID jab right now as well. And the way to do that is to contact your GP, who can put you in touch to get a COVID jab, or you can go online and book your COVID jab right now.
That's very helpful. Thanks, Craig. And I'm of an age where I was offered both COVID and flu, and I had one jab in each arm. But this person writes and says, I've heard that the COVID vaccine isn't that effective against the Omicron variant. How important is it that I take it?
So the COVID jab is really effective. As far as vaccines go, it's one of the most effective vaccines we've ever had. And it's really important that you get it. So the COVID vaccine isn't designed to stop you getting COVID, or even designed to stop you passing it on. It's designed to stop you getting sick from COVID. It's designed to keep you out of hospital, and it's designed to prevent death. It does cover Omicron. It covers the latest variants. The new COVID vaccine that you'll receive as part of the autumn booster programme has 2 different types of COVID variants in it, and it's really important that you get it as soon as you can.
That's really helpful, Craig. And this person says, and what about the flu vaccine? Does it matter? Is it true that it's going to be a bad year for flu? And what should they be thinking about flu vaccine?
So I'm afraid it is going to be a bad year for flu. So at this time of year, we wouldn't normally see patients in hospital with flu, but I'm afraid we are, and that's early. So we might usually expect patients with flu in the hospital towards the end of December, and particularly in January. Right now, we have patients in hospital with flu. And because it hasn't been around for a couple of years, because of social distancing, we think it's going to hit really hard this year. And because it's early, it's so important to get your flu vaccine as quickly as you can. It's fine to have that at the same time as your COVID jab. I did, 1 in each arm. Yes, it makes your arm a bit sore for a few days, but it's absolutely worth it, and you shouldn't delay.
Good. Thank you very much, Craig. You're released for a moment. This next question is about ambulances and the emergency department. So this was somebody whose dad waited 4 hours for an ambulance, and the paramedics who came said that it was due to waiting times to offload patients at the emergency department. So ambulance couldn't offload people because the emergency department was full, and that's why nobody could come to their dad for 4 hours. Is this true, and what are you doing about it? Perhaps, Mark, you'd like to start on that.
Yes. I'd firstly just like to apologise to the questioner and their family. Ambulance handover delays are a problem throughout the country, particularly in the southwest, and Gloucestershire has really struggled with ambulance handover delays, and I'm sure people will have seen a lot of the press coverage of the ambulances that have been queuing outside the emergency department, particularly in Gloucester. The root cause, as already been mentioned, is if you can't get people out of the emergency department, you can't get people into the emergency department, etc. However, we've taken the view very strongly that there's nothing worse than waiting at home, not knowing when the ambulance is going to arrive. It's obviously very scary for people. Now, we do know that a lot of people who come to hospital by ambulance don't necessarily require hospital admission, but actually you don't know that till you've been seen and assessed. Therefore, it's really important that ambulances can get out to people as quickly as possible. And secondly, of course, there are people who are in a life-threatening condition, and time is of the essence. And therefore, we have worked really hard, particularly over the last few weeks, to release ambulances as quickly as possible. And that's been very successful. And the ambulance handover delays outside the hospitals have reduced to the lowest they've been really since last year. And the response times, which is the time that the ambulances take to get to someone's home, have reduced hugely in the last 4 to 6 weeks. And what's called Category 1, which is the most acute, and Category 2, which is the next level, and the ones that members of the public will be most concerned about, have really, really improved. And that's been really encouraging to see. It has been at the expense of moving those patients inside the hospital, and that has meant that our staff have had to work extremely hard to look after those patients. We haven't as yet seen a significant reduction in the numbers of patients in the trust who are waiting for onward care or to go home, but we have decided that we have to release the ambulances. And so firstly, we'd like to thank our staff in the hospital who are working so hard to look after these patients, and also ask for the understanding of the public that sometimes people are cared for in situations that are not as we would want. But overall, we believe this is the best way to protect the population of Gloucestershire. So yes, it has been a problem. It is significantly better than it was, but there is still work to do.
Thank you, Mark. I've got 3 more questions, so if anybody out there has got a question to ask, please put it into Slido and we'll include it. The next question then is, I'm on the waiting list for a hip replacement, this could be me, and in a lot of discomfort and pain. What is the position regarding waiting lists, and how long might I wait?
So I'm going to take that one, Deborah. Kadar would have answered that for us. Kadar's our Chief Operating Officer, and he's overseen our recovery. So as I mentioned in my highlights, we've done really well in relation to elective care. We've got fewer patients waiting than any other trust in our region. However, that said, if you are one of the patients who is waiting, it's really distressing. So if you were referred to our hospitals today for an orthopaedic procedure, you'd wait between 30 and 50 weeks for that procedure. Now, that's quite a big range, and that range is dictated by the nature of the procedure that you're waiting for and the consultant that's caring for you. However, that's for routine care. If you present with a condition that requires more urgent care, so for example, a cancer patient, we aim to treat our cancer patients within 62 days of their referral, so within 2 months as opposed to 50 weeks. And if you're assessed as being in a particularly clinically acute state, so not perhaps somebody with cancer, but somebody who's in extreme pain or a condition that's likely to become chronic and deteriorate whilst you wait, then we've got a model where you can be assessed and your priority expedited. We have what we call priority 1, 2 and 3. Priority 1 are those patients that need to be seen here and now, so life-saving surgery. 2 are those that need care more urgently, and 3 are those that are routine. But within that bucket of patients that are described as routine, there's still opportunity to be assessed and be treated more quickly if your clinician thinks that that's appropriate. And that's quite tough, isn't it? Because nobody's waiting for an operation they don't need. Everybody that's waiting for an operation needs that operation, and many of those patients will be experiencing discomfort, maybe even pain, loss of mobility. So again, not wanting to mismanage expectations, because most people waiting for a hip replacement will be in some degree of discomfort or pain. But if you think that your position is particularly acute or distressing, then you can contact your GP and be asked to refer in for another assessment.
Good, thank you very much. This question is about maternity services, and it comes in 2 parts. The first part is about there's a shortage of midwives, we know nationally and locally, and what are we doing about the shortage of midwives? And then the second is what's happening at Stroud Maternity Unit. There are concerns about at the moment the postnatal services have been stopped. When are they going to come back? And what is the prospect for Stroud Maternity Unit in the future?
Okay, let me lead off with that. I'm going to take the second one first, because I think it's really important that I say front up that there are no plans to close the maternity services in Stroud. And I know that that's a fear. I know that people worry that these temporary closures will become permanent closures and that through stealth they'll lose the services that they value so much. So stating that there are no plans to close the maternity services at Stroud. They have a future. If we wish to make changes to those services, we can't just do that. It would require a public consultation. So there's no scenario in which this can happen through the back door. However, our priority is to make sure that all of our services are safe. Mark's talked about our need to look after the whole population, the whole county. And we have got, as Deborah's alluded to, some really acute staffing shortages in midwifery. They are beginning to improve due to recent recruitments, but we determined that our priority was to provide one-to-one care for women in labour. And that includes women who wish to labour at the Stroud Maternity Unit. But to ensure we had sufficient staff to achieve that across all of our birthing units, we took a decision to temporarily close the postnatal beds at Stroud in order to continue to be able to offer births at Stroud. Now, that doesn't mean that when you've delivered your baby at Stroud, you're out the door. You can stay for 6, 12 hours, postnatal care, but after that time, as 90% of births in the county, you'll then go home to continue with your recovery. And that's the typical model. Stroud's a slightly unusual model in offering postnatal beds, but if you still require postnatal care for clinical reasons, we will provide that to women that have laboured in Stroud in one of our other units. Okay. So just to come back to the staffing issues, because these are acute, we rely upon graduates coming out of their degree training programmes as the mainstay of our new workforce. We've just had 14 new starters into our service, which is great. We had a lot of shortages in the last year due to staff absences, due to a surprisingly high maternity leave, which is slightly ironic, isn't it, given the services that we're talking about. Those things are starting to improve. We're part of a regional initiative to recruit midwives from overseas, and that isn't going to bring in large numbers, but hopefully it will bring in some. But our real focus is retention. Recruitment is never the right approach to shortages. What we want to do is to retain the amazing midwifery staff that we already have by ensuring that they can deliver the care they want to deliver, by ensuring they feel valued, by offering them opportunities for progression, giving them opportunities to develop their skills. And I'm really heartened by what I see in our midwifery services in respect of all of those things. But particularly, back to Claire's point about culture, we know that the culture in our midwifery service wasn't where we wanted it to be, but we had a really great discussion, Deborah, yesterday in one of our committees about the really promising signs that we've got there about changes in culture. And that isn't just our view. We've had a couple of external bodies come in to assess our recovery against those CQC standards, and their reflections were that maternity was feeling like an increasingly positive place to work and to give birth. And back to Deborah's shout out earlier, we were nominated the best place in the country to give birth.
Yeah, that's a great piece of news, isn't it? This is the last question that I've got, and it is a question that came up yesterday actually at a meeting that I was at, and so I'm going to ask Mark to have a go at it. And it was a question to say that we give a lot of attention, and we have in this meeting, to the problems that we face in urgent and emergency care with ambulances, with the emergency departments, with overcrowding in the wards. But what assurances can you give us that just as much attention is going across all of the Trust services? So what about children? What about cancer, maternity, a whole range of outpatient services? Are they still getting the attention they need and serving the people that they need to be serving?
Thank you. That's a great question. There's no doubt that urgent and emergency care grabs the headlines. And of course, if you're acutely unwell, the first thing you expect of your hospital is it will look after you in those circumstances. So it matters to all of us that urgent and emergency care services work well. However, the short answer to the question is yes. There is not just a focus on elective services, outpatients, but an increased focus on that, I would say, recently. We have invested in the estate for surgery, for example. We've got 2 new theatres coming online in Cheltenham soon. We have a ring-fenced ward base, particularly for elective procedures and things like orthopaedics. And you can see from our the elective recovery position that the Trust is in, that we are doing better than many trusts in terms of catching up on the backlog of elective care. In terms of outpatients, there is still some outpatient rooms that are being used for our minor injuries service in Gloucester, but that returns to outpatients any time now as we start to open some of the new space that we're building in Gloucester for the emergency department. So again, outpatients will go back to its full suite of rooms. And if you add to that the developments around virtual outpatients, which mean that we don't need as many rooms for face-to-face appointments, again, our outpatient recovery is doing pretty well, actually. One of the positive, if you can call it that, impacts of the recent attention on maternity services has been a full focus on the whole of women's and children's services. And it's probably fair to say that they've operated relatively independently in the past, very good people getting on and doing their work, but perhaps has suffered from not getting the full support of the whole organisation. And one of the things that we have addressed as we've sought to improve maternity services is that. So again, yes, paediatric services are, take an equal amount of the time of the organisation. Now, I'm sure if anybody was working in any one of the services I'd mentioned, they would say that they could do with more space, more staff, more money. That's true across all of our services. But I would hope that we are doing better now at balancing the competing interests and competing demands across all of our services to do the best we can with the Gloucestershire pound, as Karen referred to it, or more importantly, actually, our staff, who are our main resource.
That's Great, Mark. Thank you. Deb, did you want to add something?
Well, I just wanted a bit of a shout out because I'm particularly pleased, and Mark alluded to it. You may recollect that we had to lose our dedicated inpatient ward for gynaecology as part of the changes in response to the pandemic, and that caused lots of concern. We had some really distressing experience reported to us by patients who weren't being cared for in that specialist environment by nurses with specialist skills. So I'm particularly pleased that last Monday we re-established our inpatient gynaecology ward, and moreover that we also created a gynaecology assessment unit that's open 8 a.m. to 8 p.m, which means that if you're a woman who perhaps, and this happens more often than you might imagine, somebody that presents miscarrying our emergency department, nobody wants to be miscarrying in an A&E department. That isn't longer necessary. You can come direct to our gynaecology assessment unit where you'll be cared for in a place that gives you the right levels of privacy, dignity and the specialist care that you need. And my final reflection, Deb, is again, Mark's touching this to children's services, because I think, you know, if anybody is a parent or a grandparent of children, you will know how challenging the last few years have been for young people in particular, and particularly in relation to their mental health. And much of that is spilling over into our services as well as into schools and community. And we are not equipped to deal with children with severe adolescent issues, problems, but we find ourselves in a place where we have to do that on occasions, and that's difficult for our staff. It's difficult for those children and young people. It's difficult for their families. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we recognise that challenge. We're working very, very closely with our colleagues in community services who provide many of the preventative services in relation to children and young people. We're working with the local authority that provides services to education, provides services in relation to social care, because this for me is almost the kind of silent pandemic in terms of one of the legacies that has arisen for young people. So just want to acknowledge that whilst we're not leading on that agenda, because it is very much around prevention and support in the community, we're very much playing our part and to some extent providing a safety net for those children who have kind of fallen between the cracks because they couldn't access the mental health care that they needed during the pandemic.
Okay, that's a sobering and very honest reflection there. Thank you for that. I haven't got any more questions, so I am proposing to close our annual members' meeting. Before I do so, I would like to thank our communications team and our governance team for all the work that's gone into arranging this event. I'd like to thank the executive for the work that they've done and the questions and the answers they've prepared and thought through carefully, and the candour with which you've answered. I'd like to thank Alan and the governors, and then I'd like to thank everyone who's participated in this from home or from their offices or wherever you have been. Thank you very much indeed.